Well, good morning everyone, and thank you again for joining me on what is going to be week 8 of our Chronological Bible Reading Plan. Well done for making it this far. I'm coming to you from outdoors because we've been blessed with summer-like weather this weekend, so I thought I'd catch some rays. So excuse the sunglasses, but I thought I need to get some sun before autumn and winter really kick in. All right. Now this week, as you know, we're finishing off the book of Leviticus. If you have worked through the first 18 chapters, well done, because I've got to say, with Job, Leviticus is probably one of the most difficult books to read. So well done if you're keeping up with us. We're going to finish Leviticus this week, so please do that. And then, of course, we're going to kick into the book of Numbers. Just something again to remind you, these tutorials, remember, are not about explaining the theology or explaining any of the heart issues, I guess, the reflection issues of reading through the scripture. I'm really here week after week to help remind you of the big picture, give you some type of heads up of what's coming, but to constantly remind you of the big picture. So let me just start again by saying this. The book of Leviticus is written in the 1-year period between God's people leaving Egypt and then leaving Sinai. Okay, so it's taken them 2 months to get to Mount Sinai, and they're at Mount Sinai for around about, therefore, 10 months. And in that time, a lot of stuff happens. The 10 Commandments came, the law is given, and the book of Leviticus is written with a whole bunch of instructions, primarily to the Levites, but not really, not exclusively, sorry. This week, we're going to also see that there are a number of extra laws given to the whole Israelite community. And you're going to particularly see that in the next few chapters. And as I was reading my readings today, I was kind of reflecting that, you know, a lot of the laws that you read this week actually will seem quite reasonable. Some of them are like, yeah, that's a good rule, that's a good law, I can understand that. Others of them are really random, and to be honest, and some of them are also really specific. I mean, I was reading through some of the sexual laws. I know sex seems to come up in these tutorials a bit, sorry about that. But reading through some of the sexual laws and just thinking, man, they are really particular. Moses is being really specific, or God is being really specific on these laws. But remember, the whole reason for that, and this will come up in the readings this week, is that God is giving these laws. One of the reasons is this, is because he wants his people to live distinct from the nations around them, okay? They already are distinct. They already have been set apart or made holy. They already are different because they're in a covenant with God. They're Abraham's offspring, okay? And they have this covenant that was given to them at Mount Sinai. So legally speaking, they already are distinct. But God's saying, I want you to live a lifestyle that is distinct so that you guys so establish a culture that you don't just become absorbed into the way of living of the nations around you. And on this side of the cross, on this side of history, we know that one of the main reasons for that is that so God could preserve the Hebrew people, so that the Savior, Jesus, could come through that line. If the Hebrew people and their culture just dissolved into the nations, then there would never be a Hebrew Messiah that could come. So having a very strict Hebrew culture that could be perpetuated generation through generation is very important in that regard. But at this point of history, all they know is that God is wanting them to say, listen, God is wanting to say to them, you've been in Egypt for hundreds of years. You haven't had your own culture. You haven't had your own law, but you are now a nation under my leadership, and I want you to live distinctly. And so that is why a lot of the laws that seem really random to you and me, or seem pretty damn specific, okay? A lot of that is because they are specific laws that counter the practices of the people, the other nations at that time in history. If God was setting aside a special people for himself today, a lot of these laws would not be included. Okay, the point is he's trying to be specifically relate the practices of the nations around them and give very specific rules so that they don't get sucked into that lifestyle and that way of living. So I hope that kind of makes sense. The other thing you'll see this week is that God emphasizes a lot, as I said, of culture. It's not just about obeying rules, but there's a lot of public holidays, a lot of festivals, a lot of festivity, a lot of celebrations that are to be remembered. And that, again, is a way of establishing a real cohesive culture for God's people. You know, culture is powerful. Rules are one thing, but establishing culture where this is just the way we do it around here, that's a whole nother thing. And so having public holidays and celebrations and a calendar, all that is really important to establishing culture. The other thing I want you to note, and that really stood out to me today, is when you get to chapter 26, the end of Leviticus, and we'll finish Leviticus just talking about this. But at the end of chapter 26, God reminds Moses that these rules, these laws, these Levitical, these civil laws are not just civil laws, okay? God has entered into a covenant with people. And so it's not just that, hey, these are a good way to run your society. Okay, no, it's more than that. These are covenant laws that come with covenant consequences. And God makes that super duper clear in chapter 26, where he openly says, if you obey my laws, I myself will bless you. But if you disobey my laws, I myself will raise the sword against you, and I myself will oversee your destruction and your devastation. I mean, it is real harsh language, but that is the language of religion. Do good, get good, do bad, get bad. God will come out to curse you. That's why we're so grateful we're in a whole new covenant on the other side of the cross. But here, God wanted to make that very clear to them. If you disobey me, I myself will come out against you. And so notice that in chapter 26. And also notice that Moses is not just saying God will do this if you disobey. But Moses begins very subtly, but I think you'll notice, he begins to almost prophesy that this will happen. He starts talking about their future generations in a way that it's almost inevitable they will disobey and that God will punish them 7 times over. It's very depressing and it gets worse by the time we get to Deuteronomy, believe me. But I just want you to notice that of all these rules and laws that we've been reading, they are not just to govern them civilly, but God himself will execute consequences from heaven should they disobey him, because they've entered not only into civil law, they've entered into a covenantal relationship with God at Mount Sinai, a relationship that was altogether different to the arrangement they had with Abraham. Okay, there you go. That's Leviticus. Well done. You finished Leviticus, or you will finish Leviticus this week. Then we're going to head into the book of Numbers, and a big sigh of relief. Numbers is far more straightforward. It's a much easier read than Leviticus, in my opinion anyway. The word Numbers comes from the Greek Old Testament. They basically called it Numbers because it has a number of big census lists in them, and you see one of them right up in chapter 1. The Hebrew Bible, of course, as I said, don't have specific names for the books. They just name them after the first sentence of the book. So in the Hebrew Bible, they would simply call this book In the Desert. Okay, that's the name of the book, and that's pretty good explanation actually, because Numbers basically talks about their 40-year history in the desert before they move into the promised land. So that's how much history the book of Numbers is going to cover. They should go straight into the promised land, and we hope that they do. But as we find out in next week's readings, they don't end up doing them. So this week, all you're going to be reading is chapters 1 to 6. It's very straightforward. It's all pretty well good news. In the first opening chapters, Moses basically rallies an army or conscripts people aged 20 years and over into an army based in the 12 tribes. The Levites are not included. You remember I said a couple of weeks ago that whilst there are strictly speaking 13 tribes, the Levites are often left out when it comes to land possession and when it comes to the army. So there's always this thing of there's really 13, but there's only really 12 tribes. And so there's 12 tribes that form an army. They camp around the sanctuary, and God is giving them instructions about how to move on. And this opening chapters, as I said, starts out really well, because as you'll see time after time, whatever God tells them, the chapters end by saying they did what God commanded, they did what God commanded, they did what God commanded. And so they start in the book of Numbers on a really positive note. But then, as we'll find out next week, it doesn't last very long. And I wonder whether it has something to do with, at this point in history, remember, they are still camped at Mount Sinai. The graves of their 3,000 cousins and brothers and sisters that the Levites put to death when Moses came down to mountain. They were worshipping a golden calf. You remember that in Exodus? 3,000 of them were killed. Their graves are still there. They are still camped by Mount Sinai. And so I think that the presence of Mount Sinai and possibly the presence of those graves is enough incentive for them to say, we'll do whatever Moses says. And so in this week's readings, you'll see them starting off really well. Unfortunately, of course, it doesn't last long, but I don't want to spoil that. That'll be for next week. I think that's enough. I'm going to go for under 10 minutes this week. How do you like that? Get out and get some sun this weekend, guys. Enjoy reading this week's readings. Well done. Finish Leviticus. Please do that. And we're going to kick into Numbers.